Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening to all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my great pleasure for being invited to address this important occasion. So, the topic of the seminar today, combating international terrorism. As a legal academician, an academic who has involved in the research in the issue of terrorism, let me talk about a bit more about legal aspects of terrorism. Generally, what we call terrorism, whenever we find the ism word, terrorism, it's mostly related to sociological, psychological, and other ideological perspective of the subject. But when we talk about actual act of terror, means what? When we talk about violence, ordinary sense of violence, it's suppressed by a law of the country, it's been by criminal law. In times of armed conflict, parties to an armed conflict, they engage in violence that is by the international law, that is permitted, accepted, because they have the right to engage in armed conflict. In times of armed conflict, parties to the conflict are permitted only to use violence against identified, recognized combatants. They cannot use violence against non-combatants. Who are non-combatants? Civilians, and also who are injured soldier, wounded soldier, sick soldier, who are surrendered soldiers. They cannot be targeted at any time. If a soldier targeting these non-combatants, what we call act of terror, or otherwise what we call violation of international humanitarian law. So at this point we are talking about combating international terrorism. I take this point because the meaning of definition of terrorism has taken a long discourse in the international legal history. During our research, we found around more than 110 definitions. Why we found different definitions? One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. At the same time, the act of terror is targeting non-combatants, civilians, and non-military targets. So, creating fear among civilians and achieving military objectives. So, that is condemned. That is known as violation of international law, and also if it's committed in times of armed conflict, we call that violence a war crime. Then we were thinking about how to define the terrorism. Most of the scholars agree on a simple definition called it's a form of violence used against or motivated for political, ideological, for military purposes against secondary targets. That means not the first target, secondary targets. Secondary targets means non-combatants. Maybe ordinary situation, peace situation, conflict situation, whoever to engage in this activity, what we call it is act of terror, or in other words, terrorism. When we talk about international terrorism, the parties who target non-combatants, that means civilians, they go transboundary activities, forming in one country and planning in another country activities, executing in another country. In such a way, they are transforming country to country. That is what we call international terrorism. There are many other definitions. When we talk about parties to the conflict or parties who are engaging using this, historically, when we see the historical account, we found one record post French Revolution. We found one leader called Maximilien Robespierre. He used violence against innocents or whoever came against the Republican system. He suppressed. He used the violence. That means state used violence against civilians. That's called state terrorism. But after some time, the state terrorism faded away, and non-state actors, they took the charge of these sort of activities. They started to target civilians in order to compel or giving pressure to the authorities and state and government to listen to them or to pressurize them to do or not to do certain things. What is the modern context? When we see the modern context, we hear that again the history repeating. Sometimes we see states since 1945, after the establishment of the United Nations, according to the UN Charter, states cannot use force against another state. It's a cardinal fundamental principle. So to achieve that ambition, mostly the state, they don't want to use force, but unfortunately the proxy system of conflict emerging mostly now. So that has been a big challenge these days, how to address this proxy system of war. Now the states which can't come forward and target our enemies, they create proxies and create problems and target. So eventually now what we see is whoever does, if they target civilians, if they target civilian objectives, it is condemned as international crimes. So a party or a proxy group or state commit act of violence against non-combatants, that means civilians or civilian objects, it is an international crime. So then what do you mean by international crime again? International crime always carries universal jurisdiction. Whoever, wherever commits such crimes, any state, anywhere can prosecute against it. So that has been the current scenario. So these days we are talking about how to combat international terrorism. First we identify terrorism, then we identify how transnational and international terrorism, who are the parties involved, now how to combat. When we talk about combat means how to suppress, how to face, how to eliminate this international terrorism. The United Nations, as a leading organization for the purpose of international peace and security, There are a series of efforts were taken. Even before the United Nations, it's 1930s, they appointed several missions and commissions to study this and address international terrorism to combat. Unfortunately, to date, they could not achieve a comprehensive document on terrorism. That's very unfortunate situation. When you do the research and you can find out, there is no a comprehensive international convention on the definition and terrorism. But there are other auxiliary supportive conventions are there. Terrorist bombing, terrorist finance, and regional conventions, even SAARC countries, South Asian, we have a convention. There are many other conventions. So the combating terrorism becoming a more challenging factor to the modern states. However, there are other organizations. When we talk about organizations, intergovernmental organizations, they have taken a number of steps. First, to understand how this aspect of terrorism is spreading through the minds of the people. So therefore, the states and non-state organizations, they are working towards creating global coordination, global network to enlighten people not to get involved or prevent people from involving these sort of organizing. And tactics and strategies are being planned to follow, to resolve the problems peacefully, amicably, rather than resorting to violence. And also, when we see why people choose the way of violence, because their problems are not addressed by peaceful means or justly, or they are being disappointed by the parties who are making decisions. So then we have to address the problems, root cause of the problems. Finally, ideological extremism. Ideologically, people feel violence is only the solution for resolving a problem. That also should be addressed. Then, when we talk about security measures, we know that at present there are two major conflicts are going on: Ukrainian and Russian war, and also Gaza-Israeli attacks. So this is we define as a armed conflict. If it's an armed conflict, there are cardinal principles should be followed. Main principle is what we call principle of distinction. Parties to the conflict, you have to adopt principle of distinction. Distinguish between military and civilian objects, civilian and military combatants. If you fail to distinguish between these two, you are committing a war crime. Second cardinal principle what we identify, military necessity. Military necessity. When military corps, so today we are commemorating General Soleimani, military planning is there. When we plan military tactics, military movements, they have certain objective achieved. Every minute by minute, hours by hour, and day by day, they have to achieve some military objectives. When we move towards military necessity, balance humanity also. Why? Because soldiers, combatants carry weapons and ammunition with them. They can target enemies. They can encounter civilians. So nobody can question. They can use force. They can target them. At that time, one hand, military necessity. On the other hand, humanity, mercy, kindness. So therefore, that also should be balanced in times of armed conflict. Another principle, what we call in times of armed conflict, what we call principle of proportionality. The retaliation or the response to the enemy's attack there should be a proportionate use of force. Excessive use of force is prohibited. Right? Finally, what we call choice of means and methods of warfare. That means weapons or tactics are not unlimited. That means restricted. We cannot choose whatever the weapons, whatever the military tactics. Those are limited. When we use weapons, the purpose of conflict not to eliminate or kill enemy, to ensure the enemy is taken under control. So therefore, creating superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering to enemy is also prohibited. So I have listed out all these principles because in times of armed conflict, that means permitted, armed conflict is a permitted way of resolving problem in the world now. In times of armed conflict, we had to follow all these principles, but other times it's very, very restricted. So therefore, anyone violate this principle, we call them war crimes. They are committing war crimes. War crimes are international crimes. It is the obligation and responsibility of the entire international community to stand against that. So that is the quest of the entire world now. We are looking for what is the reaction of the world. Are you ready to walk the talk? We are waiting and we are looking for that. Finally, public opinion and perception should be built. We have to talk about this. Unfortunately, as a teacher of international law, in the recent past, we are finding very difficulty in our classroom to teach. I do teach international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, we teach. So the current scenarios putting us into trouble. We teach international law, which was developed by international community. When these atrocities are happening, international communities are damn silent. Even the Security Council is divided. General Assembly could not move on. What is the alternatives? Then we look for history. In 1950s also, the same thing happened. 1950s, when the Security Council was divided, they could not pass a resolution. So the big power, what we call superpowers, they were using the affirmative vote. That means we call veto. They could not pass a resolution. Then the General Assembly assumed powers. How? It's called Uniting for Peace Resolution, through which the General Assembly set on their own feet, passed resolutions to achieve international peace and security. Then they passed budgets. They deployed international peacekeeping force to the designated locations in the world. So therefore, now we are looking for, if the Security Council can't do anything to address this international terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism, General Assembly should assume its duty and address. Otherwise, international community becoming very international community is becoming very problematic thing to people, because we trust international community. They will address the problems. So therefore, with this limited time, I shared some thoughts: the definition of terrorism, challenges out of terrorism, how this act of terror used in times of peace, in times of armed conflict, what we expect from international community. So therefore, on this occasion, I be able to share some few ideas. So with this remark, I conclude my address. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.